The Command from the Stone, Rilke's experience. I will first of all present an aesthetic example to explain the phenomenon of vertical tensions and their meaning for the reorientation of the confused existence of modern humans. That well-known sonnet, Archaic Torso of Apollo, which opens the cycle New Poems, the Other Part, from 1908. Beginning with a poetic text seems apposite because, aside from the fact that the title of this book is taken from it, its assignment to the artistic field makes it less likely to provoke those anti-authoritarian reflexes which follow almost compulsively from any encounter with statements made dogmatically or from above. What does above mean, anyway? The aesthetic construct, and nothing else, has taught us to expose ourselves to a non-enslaving experience of rank differences. The work of art is even allowed to tell us, those who have run away from form, something because it quite obviously does not embody the intention to confine us. Poetry is no longer imposed. Beauty is exposed. Something that exposes itself and proves itself in this test gains unpresumed authority. In the space of aesthetic simulation, which is at once the emergency space for the success and failure of the artistic construct, the powerless superiority of the works can affect observers who otherwise take pains to ensure that they have no lord, old or new, above them. Rilke's torso is particularly suited to posing the question of the source of authority, as it constitutes an experiment about allowing oneself to be told something. As we know, Rilke, under the influence of Auguste Rodin, whom he assisted between 1905 and 1906 in Muiden as a private secretary, turned away from the Art Nouveau-like, sensitized, atmospheric, poetic approach of his early years, to pursue a view of art determined more strongly by the priority of the object. The proto-modern pathos of making way for the object without depicting it in a manner true to nature, like that of the old masters, led in Rilke's case to the concept of the thing poem, and thus to a temporarily convincing new answer to the question of the source of aesthetic and ethical authority. From that point it would be the things themselves from which all authority would come, or rather, from this respectively current singular thing that turns to me by demanding my full gaze. This is only possible because thing-being would now no longer mean anything but this, having something to say. In this field, and with his means, Rilke carried out an operation that one could philosophically describe as the transformation of being into message, more commonly linguistic turn. Being that can be understood is language, Heidegger would later state, which conversely implies that language abandoned by being becomes mere chatter. When, and only when, being contracts in privileged things and turns to us via these things, can we hope to escape the increasing randomness, both aesthetically and philosophically. In the face of the galloping inflation of chatter, it was inevitable that such a hope would draw in numerous artists and people of spirit around 1900. In the midst of the ubiquitous dealings with prostituted signs, the thing poem was capable of opening up the prospect of returning to credible experiences of meaning. It did this by tying language to the gold standard of what things themselves communicate. Where randomness is disabled, authority should so shine forth. It is clear enough that not everything can be elevated to the rank of a thing, otherwise everything and everyone would be speaking once more, and the chatter would spread from humans to things. Rilke privileges two categories of entities, sein and in, to express it in the papery diction of philosophy. that are eligible for the lofty task of acting as message things, artificers and living creatures, with the latter gaining their particular quality from the former, as if animals were beings' highest works of art before humans. Inherent to both is a message energy that does not activate itself, but requires the poet as a decoder and messenger. This underlies the complicity between the speaking of things and Rilke's poetry, just as, only a few years later, Heidegger's things would conspire with the legend of a contemplative philosophy that no longer wants to be a mere scholastic discipline. These somewhat exhilarated remarks outline a framework in which we can attempt a brief reading of the torso poem. I am assuming that the torso mentioned in the sonnet is meant to embody a thing in the eminent sense of the word, precisely because it is merely the leftover of a complete sculpture. We know from accounts of Rilke's life that his stay in Rodin's workshop taught him how modern sculpture had advanced to the genre of the autonomous torso. The poet's view of the mutilated body thus has nothing to do with the previous century's romanticism of fragments and ruins. It is part of the breakthrough in modern art to the concept of the object that states itself with authority, and the body that publicizes itself with authorization. Archaic torso of Apollo. We never knew his head and all the light that ripened in his fabled eyes, but his torso still glows like a gas lamp dimmed, in which his gaze, lit long ago, holds fast and shines. Otherwise the surge of the breast could not blind you, nor a smile run through the slight twist of the loins toward that centre where procreation thrived. Otherwise the stone would stand deformed and curt under the shoulder's transparent plunge, and not glisten just like wild beast's fur, and not burst forth from all its contours like a star, for there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life. Whoever absorbs anything vaguely concrete upon first reading has understood this much. The poem is dealing with perfection. A perfection that seems all the more binding and mysterious because it is the perfection of a fragment. It is reasonable to suppose that this work was also an expression of thanks to Rodin, his master in his Paris days, for the concept of the autonomous torso, which he had encountered in his workshop. The reason for the existence of the perfection conjured up in these 14 lines is that it possesses, independently of its material carrier's mutilation, the authorization to form a message that appeals from within itself. The power of appeal is exquisitely evident in the object evoked here. The perfect thing is that which articulates an entire principle of being. The poem has to perform no more and no less than to perceive the principle of being in the thing and adapt it to its own existence, with the aim of becoming a construct with an equal power to convey a message. Rilke's torso can be experienced as the bearer of the attribute perfect, because it brings along something that permits it to snub the usual expectation of a morphological whole. This gesture is one of the motifs of modernity's turn against the principle of imitating nature. That is to say, imitating predefined morphological expectations. It is still capable of perceiving message totalities and autonomous thing signals when no morphologically intact figures are left. Indeed, precisely then. The sense for perfection withdraws from the forms of nature, probably because nature itself is in the process of losing its ontological authority. The popularization of photography also increasingly devalues the standard view of things. As the first edition of the visible, nature comes into discredit. It can no longer assert its authority as the sender of binding messages, for reasons that ultimately come from its disenchantment through being scientifically explored and technically outdone. After this shift, being perfect takes on an altered meaning. It means having something to say that is more meaningful than the chatter of conventional totalities. Now the torsos in their ilk have their turn. An hour of those forms that do not remind us of anything has come. Fragments, cripples, and hybrids formulate something that cannot be conveyed by the common whole forms and happy integrities. Intensity beats standard perfection. 100 years after Rilke pointed to this, we probably understand it better even than his own contemporaries, as our perceptual capacity has been numbed and plundered by the chatter of flawless bodies more than in any preceding generation. These observations will have made it clear how the phenomenon of being spoken to from above embodies itself in an aesthetic construct. To understand an appeal experience of this kind, it is not necessary to address the assumption, accepted by Rilke, that the torso he describes was once the statue of a god, of Apollo, the curators of the day believed. One cannot entirely rule out an element of Art Nouveau-esque reverence for education in the poet's experience of the sculpture. It is said that Rilke encountered the poem's real-life model during a visit to the Louvre, and as far as we know, it would have been a piece from the classical period of Greek sculpture rather than an archaic work of art. What the poet has to say to the torso of the supposed Apollo, however, is more than a note on an excursion to the antiques collection. The author's point is not that the thing depicts an extinct god who might be of interest to the humanistically educated, but that the god in the stone constitutes a thing construct that is still on air. We are dealing with a document of how newer message ontology outgrew traditional theologies. Here, being itself is understood as having more power to speak and transmit, and more potent authority than God, the ruling idol of religions. In modern times, even a god can find himself among the pretty figures that no longer mean anything to us, assuming they do not become openly irksome. The thing filled with being, however, does not cease to speak to us when its moment has come. We are approaching the critical point. The final two lines have always captivated readers. They awaken feelings of significance that virtually unhinge the entire lyric construct, as if it were merely the path towards a climax for which the rest is laid out. And indeed, the two closing sentences, "For there is no place that does not see you, you must change your life," almost began an independent career, imprinting themselves on the memories of the educated in general, not only Rilke admirers and poetry fanatics. I admit, on this particular occasion, I am inclined to agree with the need to take lines out of their context, not least because the popular taste for the beautiful places sometimes contains a valid judgment on authentic moments of climax. One does not need to be an enthusiast to understand why the closing lines have developed a life of their own. In their dignified brevity and mystical simplicity, they radiate an art evangelical energy that can scarcely be found in any other passage from recent language art. At first glance, the initial statement seems the more enigmatic one. Whoever understands or accepts it, or allows it to apply in the lyric context, which amounts to the same in this case, is immediately affected by an almost hypnotic suggestion. By seeking to understand, one gives credit to a turn of phrase that reverses the everyday relationship between the seer and the seen. That I see the torso with its stout shoulders and stumps is one aspect. That I dreamily add the missing parts, the head, the arms, the legs, the genitals, in my mind, and associatively animate them is a further aspect. If need be, I can even follow Rilke's suggestion and imagine a smile extending from an invisible mouth to vanished genitals. A completely different aspect, however, the thoroughly incommensurable one, lies in the imposition of accepting that the torso sees me while I observe it. Indeed, that it eyes me more sharply than I can look at it. The ability to perform the inner gesture with which one makes space for this improbability inside oneself most probably consists precisely in the talent that Max Weber denied having. This talent is religiosity. Understood as an innate disposition and a talent that can be developed, making it comparable to musicality. One can practice it just as one practices melodic passages or syntactic patterns. In this sense, religiosity is congruent with certain grammatical promiscuity. Where it operates, objects elastically exchange places with subjects. Therefore I accept that there are, on the shimmering surface of the mutilated stone, numerous places that amount to eyes and see me. I am performing an operation with a micro-religious quality, and which, once developed, one will recognize at all levels of macro-religiously developed systems as the primary module of a pious inner action. In the position where the object usually appears, never looking back because it is an object. I now recognize a subject with the ability to look and return gazes. Thus, as a hypothetical believer, I accept the insinuation of a subject that dwells inside the respective place, and wait to see what this pliable development will make of me. We note, even the deepest or most virtuosic piety cannot achieve more than habitualized insinuations. I receive the reward for my willingness to participate in the object-subject reversal in the form of a private illumination. In the present case, as an aesthetic movedness. The torso, which has no place that does not see me, likewise does not impose itself. It exposes itself. It exposes itself by testing whether I will recognize it as a seer. Acknowledging it as a seer essentially means believing in it, where believing, as noted above, referred to the inner operations that are necessary to conceive of the vital principle in the stone as a sender of discrete addressed energies. If I somehow succeed in this, I am also able to take the glow of subjectivity away from the stone and receive the star-like eruption of its surplus of authority and soul. It is only in this context that the name of the depicted has any significance. What appears in the former statue of Apollo, however, cannot simply be equated with the Olympian of the same name, who had to ensure light, contours, foreknowledge, and security of form in his days of completeness. Rather, as the poem's title implies, he stands for something much older, something rising from prehistoric sources. He symbolizes a divine magma in which something of the first ordering force, as old as the world itself, becomes manifest. There is no doubt that memories of Rodin and his cyclopean work ethic had an effect on Rilke here. During his work with the great artist, he experienced what it means to work on the surfaces of bodies until they are nothing but a fabric of carefully shaped, luminous, almost seeing places. A few years earlier he had written of Rodin's sculptures that there were endless places and none of them did not have something happening in them. Each place is a point at which Apollo, the god of forms and surfaces, makes a visually intense and haptically palpable compromise with his older opponent, Dionysus, the god of urges and currents. That this energized Apollo embodies a manifestation of Dionysus is indicated by the statement that the stone glistens like wild beast's fur. Rilke had read his Nietzsche. Here we encounter the second micro-religious or proto-musical module, the notorious "this stands for that." The one appears in the other, or the deep layer is present in the surface. Figures without which no religious discourse would ever have come about. They tell us that religiosity is a form of hermeneutical flexibility and can be trained. For there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life. It remains to be shown why the second sentence, which seemingly requires no interpretation, is actually far more enigmatic than the first. It is not only its lack of preparation, its suddenness that is mysterious. You must change your life. These words seem to come from a sphere in which no objections can be raised, nor can we establish from where they are spoken. Only their verticality is beyond doubt. It is unclear whether this dictum shoots straight up from the ground to stand in my way like a pillar, or falls from the sky to transform the road before me into an abyss, such that my next step should already belong to the changed life that has been demanded. It is not enough to say that Rilke retranslated ethics in an aestheticizing fashion into a succinct, cyclopean, archaic, brutal form. He discovered a stone that embodies the torso of religion, ethics and asceticism as such, a construct that exudes a call from above, reduced to the pure command, the unconditional instruction, the illuminated utterance of being that can be understood, and which only speaks in the imperative. If one wished to transfer all the teachings of the papyrus religions, the parchment religions, the stylus and quill religions, the calligraphic and typographical, all order rules and sect programs, all instructions for meditation and doctrines of stages, and all training programs and deontologies into a single workshop where they would be summarized in a final act of editing, their utmost concentrate would express nothing other than what the poet sees emanating from the archaic torso of Apollo in a moment of translucidity. You must change your life. This is the imperative that exceeds the options of hypothetical and categorical. It is the absolute imperative, the quintessential metanoetic command. It provides the keyword for revolution in the second person singular. It defines life as a slope from its higher to its lower forms. I am already living, but something is telling me with unchallengeable authority, you are not living properly. The numinous authority of form enjoys the prerogative of being able to tell me, you must. It is the authority of a different life in this life. It is the authority of a different life in this life. This authority touches on a subtle insufficiency within me that is older and freer than sin. It is my innermost not yet. In my most conscious moment I am affected by the absolute objection to my status quo. My change is the one thing that is necessary. If you do indeed subsequently change your life, what you are doing is no different from what you desire with your whole will as soon as you feel how a vertical tension that is valid for you unhinges your life. As well as the ethical revolutionary reading, there are also somewhat more concrete and psychologically accessible interpretations of the torso poem. There is no need to limit our commentary to lofty art philosophical and being philosophical positions. The experience of authority that binds the poet for a moment to the ancient statue can perhaps be reconstructed more plausibly on a more sensual, aesthetically comprehensible level. This raises the somatic, or more precisely the autoerotic and masculine athletic impressions of the sculpture, which must have provoked in the poet, who, in the language of his time, was a neurasthenic and a weak-bodied introvert, an empathetic experience of the antipodal mode of being that is native to strong body people. This is in keeping with a fact that did not escape Rilke, namely that, in the immeasurably rich statue culture of the ancient Greeks, there was a dominant system of physical and mental kinship between gods and athletes, in which resemblance could reach the level of identity. A god was always a form of sportsman too, and the sportsman, especially the one celebrated in a hymn of praise and crowned with a laurel wreath, was always also a god of sorts. Hence the athlete's body, which unifies beauty and discipline into a calm readiness for action, offers itself as one of the most understandable and convincing manifestations of authority. The authoritative body of the god athlete has an immediate effect on the viewer through its exemplarity. It too says concisely, "You must change your life," and in so doing simultaneously shows what model this change should follow. It displays how being and being exemplary converge. Every classical statue was a petrified or bronze-cast teaching permit in ethical matters. What was known as Platonism, an otherwise rather un-Greek affair, could only find its home in Greece because the so-called ideas had already established themselves in the form of statues. Platonic love was already widely anchored in society some time before Plato, as a training affect in exercises between the somatically perfect and the beginners. And this eros worked in both directions, from the model to his emulators, and from the desirer to his model. Now, I certainly do not wish to posit any narcissistic relationship between Rilke and a fragment of ancient Greek art exhibited in the Louvre, glorifying the male body cult. It is plausible, however, that the author of that sonnet saw some of the radiance of ancient athletic vitalism and the muscular theology of the wrestlers in the palaestra in the real torso he viewed. The difference of vitality between the elevated and profane bodies must have spoken to him directly, even when faced with a mere relic of idealized masculinity. With this way of feeling, the poet would have been no more or less than a sensitive contemporary of the late Renaissance in Europe, which reached a critical stage around 1900. Its defining trait is the return of the athlete as the key figure of ancient somatic idealism. With this, the process of post-Christian cultural reorganization that had begun around 1400 as a philological and artistic renaissance entered its mass cultural phase. Its foremost characteristic is sport, and it can never be emphasized too much how deeply it affected the ethos of the moderns. The restarting of the Olympics and the excessive popularization of soccer in Europe and South America marked the beginnings of its triumph, whose end is barely in sight unless one interprets the current doping corruption as the indication of an imminent breakdown, though no one can say at present what might replace athleticism. The cult of sport that exploded around 1900 possesses an outstanding intellectual historical, or rather ethical historical and asceticism historical significance, as it demonstrates an epochal change of emphasis in practice behaviour. A transformation, best described as re-somatization, or a despiritualization of asceticisms. In this respect, sport is the most explicit realization of young Hegelianism, the philosophical movement whose motto was the resurrection of the flesh in this life. Of the two great ideas of the 19th century, socialism and somatism, it was clearly not the latter that could be widely established, and one need not be a prophet to assert that the 21st century will belong to it completely, even more than the 20th. After all we have said, it does not seem inappropriate to suggest that Rilke had some participation in the somatic and athletic Renaissance, even though his connection was obviously indirect and mediated by artifacts, namely the category of things discussed above. Rilke certainly made no secret of feeling stimulated by Nietzsche, and he equally, in a letter to the young worker, took up the timely cause of reclaiming sexuality from the crippling tradition of Christian renunciation of instincts. The presence of the athletic mana in the torso, still shining and licensed to teach, contains an element of orientational energy that I shall term, even if the phrase initially seems inappropriate, trainer authority. In this capacity and character, it addresses the present-day weaklings of the body and of life with words of an unmistakably sport-ethical nature. The statement, "You must change your life," can now be heard as a refrain of a language of getting in shape. It forms part of a new rhetorical genre, the coach discourse, their changing room lecture to a weekly performing team. Whoever speaks to teams must address each individual player as if speaking to them alone. Such speeches cannot be tolerated in company, but they are constitutive for teams. Give up your attachment to comfortable ways of living. Show yourself in the gymnasium, gymnos meaning naked. Prove that you are not indifferent to the difference between perfect and imperfect. Demonstrate to us that achievement, excellence, arete, virtue, that it has not remained a foreign word to you. Admit that you have motives for new endeavours, and above all, only grant the suspicion that sport is a pastime for the most stupid as much space as it deserves. Do not misuse it as a pretext to drift further into your customary state of self-neglect. Distrust the Philistine in yourself, who thinks you are just fine as you are. Hear the voice from the stone. Do not resist the call to get in shape. Seize the chance to train with a God.